If I had stayed inside that day, I would still be the same woman I was before. I have lived in this village my whole life. It's the kind of place that never makes it to a map, where life moves slowly and news travels faster than the wind. I run a small shop on the corner of the main street. A wooden counter, 2 old shelves, a kettle for tea, and a small tin box for my earnings. That morning, the sky was the color of wet ash, and the wind carried a smell that told me the rain would be heavy. I could feel it in my bones before the first drop even fell. By the time I opened my shop, the rainy season had arrived in full force. Fat drops pounded the tin roof with a deafening thuk thuk thuk, and the wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls. The street outside was already turning into a brown river. My patched sandals squelched with every step I took. Inside, I moved quickly, placing 3 metal buckets under the leaks in the roof. The sharp plink, plink, plink of water hitting metal echoed like a slow, deliberate clock. I wrapped my faded shawl tighter around me and stared out at the empty street. Not a single soul was outside. Even the stray dogs had vanished into whatever shelter they could find. And then, I saw him. At first, just a shadow through the curtain of rain. A figure hunched under a piece of rusted tin, wedged against the wall of an abandoned shop. The sheet was shaking violently in the wind, doing little to keep him dry. I squinted, trying to make out his features. As the rain shifted, I saw him clearly. An old man. His clothes hung off him like rags on a scarecrow. The fabric was so soaked it clung to his thin frame. His skin was pale, the kind of pale that spoke of long days without proper food. His lips trembled with the cold. His hands, bony, fragile, gripped the tin sheet as though it was his last shield against the world. My heart clenched. I had my own problems. The shop had been earning less each month, prices had gone up, and the pantry at home was nearly empty. The sensible thing would have been to stay inside, keep warm, and wait for the storm to pass. But a different voice inside me, quieter but stronger, reminded me of nights I'd gone to bed, hungry, praying for someone to notice. I remembered the sharp ache in my stomach and the dull ache in my heart, when help never came. Before I could think it through, I reached for my only umbrella. The handle was smooth from years of use, the fabric patched twice over. I stepped outside, and the rain struck me like cold needles. The street was a battlefield of water and wind. Each step I took, the mud sucked at my sandals. My dress clung to my legs, heavy and wet. I kept my head down against the wind until I reached him. When I tilted the umbrella over his head, he looked up. His eyes. They weren't empty like I expected. They were sharp, almost too sharp for someone in his state, but tired. So tired it was as if the weight of years sat on his shoulders. "Do you have anywhere to go?" I asked, my voice loud to compete with the roar of the storm. Slowly he shook his head. The rain dripped from his hair, down the lines of his face, and off his chin. "Come," I said simply. He hesitated for a second, almost as if he wasn't used to someone offering. But then he followed. I led him to my shop porch, holding the umbrella so that most of the rain fell on me instead of him. The wooden boards creaked under his weight as he stepped inside. I motioned to an old chair near the counter. He lowered himself into it carefully, as though afraid it might collapse. "I'll get you something warm," I said, heading behind the counter. I poured tea from the kettle, the steam curling into the air, carrying the faint scent of cardamom. On a small plate, I placed the last 2 pieces of bread I had, slightly stale, but still edible. When I set them down in front of him, he hesitated, his eyes flicking from the bread to my face. Then, slowly, he reached for them. His fingers shook, and not just from the cold. He took a sip of the tea, letting the warmth seep into his bones, then began eating the bread in small, deliberate bites. The sound of the rain outside became a soft backdrop. Inside, it was quiet, except for his slow chewing and the occasional plink of water in the buckets. Halfway through his bread, He looked up and met my eyes. "You remind me," he said quietly, "of someone I lost." There was a heaviness in his voice that made me stop. The way he said it, it was not casual. It was like he was holding on to a memory that hurt too much to speak of. I didn't ask who. Some silences are meant to be respected. When he finished, he set the empty cup on the counter and stood up. I told him he could wait until the rain stopped completely, but he shook his head. At the door, he paused and looked at me again, his gaze steady, as if trying to memorize my face. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he stepped back into the rain. I watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller until the curtain of rain swallowed him. I thought that was it, a brief act of kindness for a stranger I'd never see again. But just as I turned to close the shop door, I froze. Across the street, under a large black umbrella, stood another figure. This one was tall, straight-backed, and completely still. I couldn't see the face. The rain blurred everything beyond a certain distance. But I could feel the eyes on me, watching. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, just watched. And then, as if the rain itself swallowed them, they were gone. I didn't know it then, but the man I sheltered and the one who silently watched were about to bring storms far greater than the one outside my shop. They said he was no ordinary beggar, but I didn't believe them. It had been a week since that stormy afternoon, 7 long days since the old man with tired eyes sat in my shop, hands curled around a cup of tea, and said I reminded him of someone he'd lost. At first, I thought he might come back the very next day. When the rain began again, I found myself glancing toward the porch, half expecting to see his hunched figure appear in the doorway. But the chair I'd offered him stayed empty. Every morning when I unlocked the shop, I would steal a glance at the corner where I'd first seen him, crouched under that piece of rusted tin, and every time, the space was bare. The rainy season still ruled our days. Sometimes the downpour came in short bursts, other times it lasted from dawn to dusk. The roads were soft with mud, swallowing cartwheels and soaking through shoes in minutes. The air smelled of wet earth and damp wood, and the walls inside my shop felt colder than they should. Business was slow. The only customers who came were the desperate, mothers buying rice before it ran out, children sent to fetch bread, old men needing kerosene for their lamps. The rest of the town stayed indoors, listening to the storm. One afternoon, as I poured tea for a customer, I heard 2 women talking just outside my shop. Their voices carried clearly over the quiet. "Did you hear about that old man?" one asked. "The one who appears before it rains?" "Yes. My cousin saw him near the bus stop last week, just sitting there, staring at the sky until the rain started." I froze, my hand lingering over the teapot. "They say," the other woman continued in a conspiratorial whisper, "he used to be rich." Rich. The word didn't match the image in my memory. The torn clothes, the sunken cheeks, the hands trembling over a simple cup of tea. Later that day, my neighbor, the vegetable seller whose stall was next to mine, leaned over as he stacked green chilies into a basket. "They say that man you helped. He's not from here," he murmured, his voice low as though sharing a secret. "Came from the city. Some say he owned a big company once, before he lost everything." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "And you believe that?" he shrugged. "Stories have a way of growing in this place. But I've seen the way he walks. Slow, steady, like someone used to being noticed. Not like the other beggars." Over the next few days, more rumors found their way to me. Some said he never begged for money, only for a dry place to wait out the rain. Others claimed he would refuse food unless he was truly hungry. A few swore they'd seen him vanish for days, then reappear on the edge of town, just as the sky began to darken. I didn't know what to believe. But one question kept nagging at me. Why me? Out of all the shops, all the porches, all the people in this town. Why had he chosen to step under my umbrella that day? Every time the wind brought the smell of rain, I found myself standing at the doorway, scanning the street. Every time the first drops began to fall, I checked the porch, but it stayed empty. Nights grew colder. I would lie, awake, listening to the storm against the roof, wondering if he'd found shelter. A part of me feared the worst, that he'd been claimed by the cold and the wet. Another part hoped he was somewhere warm, sipping tea like the one I'd given him. And then there was the memory of that other figure, the one with the large black umbrella who had stood across the street that day, watching. I'd told no one about it. Something about it felt private, almost dangerous, and yet, sometimes I wondered if the two men were somehow connected. The days passed in this rhythm: work, rain, waiting, disappointment, until that afternoon. It began like any other. I was behind the counter, counting the coins in my till. The steady drip from the gutter outside was the only sound. Then, faintly at first, I felt it, a vibration under my feet, like a faraway drumbeat. It grew louder, closer, until the very air seemed to thrum with it. Not thunder. Engines. I straightened, frowning, and stepped to the doorway. From the far end of the street, they came. 4 sleek black cars, their paint shining like wet glass, their windows tinted dark. They moved slowly, deliberately, cutting through the muddy road as though it belonged to them. People began to notice. The vegetable seller abandoned his stall, wiping his hands on his apron as he came closer to watch. Children darted to the edges of the street, pointing and whispering excitedly. Even the shopkeepers from further down the lane leaned out of their doors to see. The cars rolled past the market stalls, their tires sending up small sprays of water. The sound of their engines was a low, powerful hum that made my chest vibrate. I expected them to pass by. They didn't. They stopped, right in front of my shop. The rain had paused, leaving only the quiet hiss of water dripping from rooftops. In that stillness, the cars idled, their engines purring like watchful predators. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands gripping the frame. From the corner of my eye, I saw my neighbors staring. Someone murmured my name, but I didn't turn. My gaze was fixed on the first car. The driver stepped out first, dressed in a black suit, scanning the street with sharp, professional eyes. He moved to the back door and opened it slowly. I didn't know it yet, but whatever was about to step out of that car was going to make every rumor I'd heard seem like a pale shadow of the truth. The first polished leather shoe hit the muddy ground, and in that moment, I realized my life was about to be rewritten. When those cars stopped, the whole town stopped breathing. It was as if time itself had paused. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, leaving the air heavy and damp. The street shimmered with puddles, each one trembling as the engines idled. The 4 black cars, gleaming like wet obsidian, looked like creatures from another world, too sleek, too perfect for our worn, muddy road. People stood frozen in place. The vegetable seller's hands, still holding a bunch of coriander, hung in mid-air. A group of children huddled together near a doorway, eyes wide, whispering in voices so low they were almost inaudible. Even the stray dog that normally barked at strangers sat silently on the steps of the tea shop, head tilted in curiosity. The driver of the first car stepped out. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit, his shoes impossibly clean despite the mud. His eyes scanned the street in sharp, calculated movements. Left, right, left again, like someone trained to notice everything. Then, without a word, he moved to the rear door and opened it. From the shadowed interior, a man stepped out. He was tall, not just in height, but in presence. The kind of presence that made people instinctively step back to give space. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored to perfection. A silk tie knotted neatly at his throat, polished leather shoes catching the dull light. He looked as though he belonged in the center of a city boardroom, not in the middle of our rain-washed street. But it wasn't just his clothes that caught my attention. It was the way he carried himself. Straight-backed, shoulders squared, every step deliberate, as if the ground itself should be grateful he was walking on it. He didn't look around at the crowd. His eyes, dark and steady, found mine instantly, and locked there. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't know this man. I was sure of it. And yet, something about the way he looked at me made my stomach tighten, as though he knew exactly who I was. He walked straight toward me, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the mud with each step. The drizzle kissed the shoulders of his suit, but he didn't seem to notice. When he reached me, he paused just a foot away. A faint smile touched his lips. Not warm, but not unfriendly either. More like someone meeting an old acquaintance after years apart. And then, he spoke my name. I froze. Hearing my name from his lips felt strange, almost intimate, like a note played on a familiar instrument, but in a different key. I'm sorry, I stammered, my voice catching. Have we met? His eyes didn't leave mine. You may not remember me, he said, his voice calm and measured. But I remember you. I felt a cold ripple travel down my spine. My mind scrambled through every memory I could pull forward. Market days, family gatherings, the occasional trip to the city. Nothing. I had never seen this man in my life. Or so I thought. The drizzle turned, too, fine mist hanging in the air between us. Behind him, the other men in suits stood silently by the cars, their expressions unreadable. The crowd kept its distance, but I could feel their stares burning into my back. Who are you? I managed to ask. His smile deepened slightly, and he took a half-step closer. I was the man, he said slowly, deliberately. You protected from the rain. The words hit me like a sudden clap of thunder. I blinked at him, certain I'd misheard. The man I'd given tea and bread to a week ago had been thin, frail, his clothes torn and his hands trembling from the cold. The man standing before me now radiated power, wealth, and authority. They weren't the same person. They couldn't be. And yet, those eyes. I saw it now. The same depth, the same watchfulness I'd noticed when I'd first tilted the umbrella over his head. Back then, they had been clouded with exhaustion and hunger. Now they were sharp and unyielding, but still carrying that hidden weight. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the shop doorway. The air between us seemed to thicken, heavy with unasked questions. Behind me, the faint plink of water, dripping into the buckets inside my shop, was the only sound that reminded me the world was still turning. My voice faltered. But how? He didn't answer yet. He simply kept looking at me, as if giving me time to catch up to the reality he had just dropped at my feet. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered loudly enough for me to hear. That's him. The one from the stories. The one from the city. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. My world had just tilted. The man I'd thought was just a passing stranger had come back in cars that didn't belong in my world, wearing a suit that cost more than my shop's monthly earnings, and speaking to me as though we were bound by something far deeper than a shared moment in a rainstorm. And now, he was standing here, in front of everyone, telling me that he remembered. I didn't know it yet, but the story he was about to tell me would tear apart everything I thought I knew about that day. And about him. I couldn't understand. How could a man in $1 million suit be the same one I'd sheltered? For a moment I couldn't speak. The air between us felt thick, like the pause before a lightning strike. The words he had just said, "I was the man you protected from the rain," echoed in my mind, bouncing between disbelief and memory. It made no sense. The man I'd seen that day had been thin, fragile, trembling from hunger and cold. His clothes had been little more than rags. His eyes, though sharp, had been dulled by exhaustion. The man standing in front of me now was the complete opposite. His posture radiated strength. His suit looked like it had been sewn for him alone, the fabric catching the faint light in a way that whispered of expense I couldn't imagine. His shoes were polished, his tie perfect. My mind rebelled at the connection. It was like being told a crow had turned into an eagle overnight. I don't understand, I said, my voice low. His gaze didn't waver. I know you don't, he replied. But you will. Behind him, the men in suits stood silently beside the line of black cars, their eyes scanning the street. The villagers had formed a loose half-circle around us, whispers darting between them like the wind that still carried the faint scent of rain. He took a breath and began. I wasn't always in this suit, he said, glancing down at himself briefly, as if the clothing was just armor. And I wasn't always the man people think I am now. I built my company from scratch. I was a boy from a small neighborhood in the city, not much better than this village in those days. I worked 3 jobs at once, skipped meals to save money, and slept in my office more nights than I can count. Slowly, I climbed. I took risks that nearly broke me. And eventually, I won. I had the kind of success people dream about. Money, a home high above the city, cars, influence. People treated me like I was untouchable. But power attracts shadows. His voice tightened, and his eyes shifted slightly, as if looking into a memory that still hurt to touch. I trusted people I thought were my friends. Business partners I'd known for years. I brought them into my home. I shared my table with them. And while they smiled at me across the dinner table, they were plotting behind my back. They manipulated contracts, planted lies in the boardroom, and within months, I was forced out of my own company. The company I had built with my hands. His jaw clenched. When you lose that kind of power, you see who your friends really are. And I learned I didn't have as many as I thought. I didn't move. I could feel the heaviness of his words settling over the crowd. Even the children had gone quiet. So, he continued, I walked away. I disappeared from the world I knew. I wanted to see people for who they were, without the filter of wealth. No one knew where I'd gone. Not my friends. Not my enemies. Not even the press. He looked me straight in the eyes. I chose to live as a man with nothing, to walk the streets with empty pockets, to see how people would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them. I felt my throat tighten. I spent weeks drifting from place to place, he said, sleeping under bridges, on the steps of shops after they closed, in alleys where the wind cut through the walls. I learned which corners stayed dry in a storm, which ones filled with water. I learned which neighborhoods would chase me away just for sitting down. And I learned something else. He paused. Most people don't see you. Not really. They glance, they look away. Sometimes they throw a coin like they're feeding a stray dog, but they don't see you. They don't ask if you've eaten. They don't ask if you're okay. I realized my hands were gripping the doorway so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. His voice softened. And then, one day, there was you. My chest tightened. I remember that day, he said. The rain was heavier than usual. I had been walking for hours with no shelter. My clothes were soaked. My bones felt like ice. I'd had nothing to eat for 2 days. I was ready to stop, to just sit down and let the rain take me. His eyes softened slightly, the steel in them giving way to something warmer. And then you stepped out from under your roof, holding an umbrella over me. You didn't ask who I was or what I had to give you. You didn't wrinkle your nose at my clothes. You didn't look at me like I was a burden. You just helped. He took a step closer. You gave me tea and bread. And for the first time in weeks, I felt warmth, not just in my hands, but here. He placed a hand over his chest. It reminded me of my mother, he continued. She was the kind of woman who would give away her last meal without thinking twice. She used to tell me, kindness is the only thing that grows when you give it away. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Until you reminded me. My knees felt weak. The drizzle had stopped completely now, but I felt as though I were still standing in the storm. "You have to understand," he said. That moment stayed with me. For the rest of the time, I was out there. Whenever I felt the cold coming in too deep. Whenever I thought I couldn't go on. I remembered you. I remembered the sound of the rain on your porch roof, the steam rising from the tea you handed me, and the way you didn't treat me like I was less than human. He glanced briefly at the cars behind him. When I returned to my life, when I put the suit back on and walked into the boardroom, I carried that memory with me. I thought about it every single day, and I decided something. I swallowed hard. "What did you decide?" "That I owed you," he said simply. Not in the way most people mean when they say that. This wasn't about repaying a favor. It was about honoring something rare, something that doesn't have a price tag. I knew I had to find you. And when I did, I would make sure you knew just how much that moment meant to me. I felt the ground beneath me tilt. This wasn't just gratitude. There was something else in his voice, something deeper, almost reverent. Around us, the villagers stood frozen, caught between curiosity and disbelief. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear my own pulse, loud and steady. He took one final step forward, close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "I came back," he said, his voice steady and certain, "because I owe you more than words, or than—" When he opened the box, the crowd gasped. And so did I. The words, "I owe you more than words," were still echoing in my head when he moved. It wasn't sudden. There was no rush in him, no impatience. Just a calm certainty, like a man who had planned this moment long before today. His hand slipped inside the inner pocket of his coat. The black fabric shifted against the crisp white of his shirt, and for a brief second, I caught the faint glint of something before he drew it out. A small box. It was no bigger than my palm, wrapped in a deep burgundy velvet so rich that it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Even from where I stood, I could see that it was flawless. No worn edges, no sign of dust. Whatever was inside had been guarded carefully. The crowd shifted, their curiosity sharpening. Whispers fluttered around me like restless birds. He held the box in one hand, his fingers resting lightly over the lid. For a moment he just looked at me, as if measuring the weight of this instant, as if deciding whether I was truly ready to see what was inside. Then, click, the lid opened. The world seemed to still around us. Inside the velvet lining lay a set of golden keys. They weren't plain, everyday keys. Each bow was engraved with delicate patterns that looped and curled like vines, catching what little daylight filtered through the clouds. The teeth were cut with precision, their edges sharp and perfect. A gasp rippled through the villagers. It was the kind of sound that spreads like fire. One voice, then two, then the whole crowd reacting at once. Keys. To what? Is it a house? Their murmurs swelled, but I couldn't move. My gaze was locked on the gold in that little box, my mind refusing to connect the dots. He lifted the keys from their nest, holding them between his fingers. The faint chime of metal against metal seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet street. Then, with a steadiness that made my chest tighten, he extended his hand toward me. "This," he said softly, his voice carrying over the crowd without effort, "is your new home." The words hit me like the first crack of thunder in a storm. Sudden, electric, impossible to ignore. I blinked at him, at the keys, at the box still open in his other hand. My mouth felt dry. I don't understand." "You will," he said. "You gave me shelter when I had none. You opened your door when the world had turned its back. Now I'm giving you a door that will always open for you." The crowd behind me murmured again, louder this time. I could feel their stares, their questions. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. "Hold out your hands," he said. I did, my fingers trembling. The keys were cool against my skin, their weight heavier than it should have been, as if they carried more than just the promise of a door. For a moment, I couldn't look at him. I stared down at the keys, tracing the patterns with my eyes, feeling their edges press lightly into my palm. Around us, the whispers kept flowing. Some voices sounded excited, others wary, and a few almost resentful. When I finally looked back up, he was still watching me. Not with pride, not with pity, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Come," he said, his tone calm, but with a spark of something unspoken. "I'll show you where it is." I thought I knew what a beautiful home looked like until I saw this place. The keys in my hand felt heavier with each step I took beside him. The golden metal pressed into my palm, warming slowly against my skin as though it already belonged there. We walked toward the waiting cars. The crowd parted for us like water breaking around a stone, their eyes following every movement. Some whispered my name. Others just stared in silence, as if trying to memorize the sight of me leaving with him. The driver in the first car opened the rear door, and he gestured for me to get in. For a moment, I hesitated. My shop, my whole life, was behind me. The narrow wooden counter, the shelves I'd dusted every morning, the leaky roof I'd cursed during storms. Everything I knew was contained within those cracked walls. But then my fingers tightened around the keys, and I stepped inside. The car smelled faintly of leather, and something clean, expensive, and unfamiliar. The seats were soft but firm, wrapping around me like they'd been made to fit. He slid in beside me, the door closing with a quiet, solid thunk. The outside world dimmed, replaced by the low hum of the engine. Through the tinted windows, I could still see the blurred shapes of villagers standing in the drizzle, watching us pull away. We drove in silence at first. The wet road curved out of town, past the fields still heavy with water from the rain. Puddles mirrored the gray sky, and the air outside was thick with the smell of wet earth and grass. I kept glancing at him, trying to read his face. He seemed calm, almost serene, as though this was the most natural thing in the world, to whisk someone away from their small shop into something far beyond their imagining. Finally, I broke the silence. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," he replied, and there was a note in his voice, not secrecy, but the quiet pleasure of someone holding a gift they can't wait to give. We left the main road after about 20 minutes, turning onto a narrower lane lined with tall trees. Their branches arched overhead, creating a green tunnel that dripped softly from the recent rain. The sound of the engine seemed muted here, replaced by the occasional call of a bird and the whisper of leaves swaying gently. The further we went, the less familiar everything became. The houses grew farther apart, the air cleaner, the ground drier. Then, just as I began to wonder if we were heading into nowhere, the trees opened up, and I saw it. At first I thought it was some kind of hotel. The size of it seemed impossible for one person to own. But as we rolled closer, the details came into focus. The mansion rose from the ground like something out of a dream. White stone walls gleamed softly in the muted light, each block perfectly cut and fitted. Rows of tall windows reflected the pale sky, their black frames elegant and sharp. A wide balcony stretched across the second floor, its railings wrought in intricate patterns of curling metal. The roof was slate gray, sloping gently before rising into decorative peaks. The driveway was paved with smooth, dark stone that glistened from the rain, curving gracefully to meet the wide front steps. And gardens. I had never seen gardens like this. Even after the storm, the flower beds were bursts of color, deep reds, bright yellows, soft purples, arranged in careful shapes that made the ground itself look like a painting. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the path, and tall, ancient-looking trees stood watch on either side, like silent guardians. The car came to a stop directly in front of the steps. For a moment I couldn't move. I sat there, staring through the glass, feeling as though my mind couldn't catch up with my eyes. My voice caught. "This isn't for me." He turned to me, and there was that small, certain smile again. "It is now." The driver opened my door, and I stepped out onto the stone driveway. The air here felt different, cleaner, lighter. Even the quiet was different, deeper somehow, as though the walls of the mansion held it in place. We walked up the steps together. Up close, the front doors were even more impressive. Tall enough that 3 men could stand on each other's shoulders and still not touch the top. They were made of dark wood, carved with scenes I didn't recognize, sweeping landscapes, curling vines, shapes that seemed to tell a story I couldn't yet read. He nodded to one of the suited men who had arrived in the other cars. The man stepped forward, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The interior stole the breath from my lungs. Light poured in from high windows, catching on polished marble floors so smooth they reflected the chandeliers above. The ceilings were impossibly high, painted with scenes of clouds and sky so realistic I almost expected them to move. To the left, a grand staircase curved upward, its banister gleaming dark wood and gold. To the right, an open doorway revealed a sitting room lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, each one filled with neatly arranged volumes. Plush chairs and sofas sat in quiet clusters, the kind you could sink into and forget the time. Straight ahead, past a hall lined with tall mirrors and vases of fresh flowers, was a pair of glass doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking the gardens I'd seen from outside. Only from here, they stretched even farther, leading into a small lake that mirrored the sky. I turned in a slow circle, trying to take it all in. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It's as real as the rain was that day," he said quietly, watching me. "And now, it's yours." The words didn't fit with the scene in front of me. My whole life had been measured in small spaces. My tiny bedroom, my narrow shop, the porch where I'd sat on warm evenings to watch the street. Now I was standing in a place so large, I felt like a single drop of water in a wide, calm sea. My voice faltered. "I don't deserve this." He shook his head once, firmly. "You deserve more than this, but this is where we start." Something in his tone made my chest ache. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was conviction, as though he truly believed I belonged here. I looked back at the grand staircase, the marble floors, the endless light. My fingers curled tighter around the keys still in my hand. He gestured toward the stairs, a hint of anticipation in his eyes. "Come," he said softly. "There's something upstairs I want you to see." I thought the mansion was the gift. I didn't know a new life was coming with it. The first morning in the mansion felt like waking up inside someone else's life. I opened my eyes to sunlight spilling through tall, arched windows, the pale gold glow softening the edges of the enormous room. The bed beneath me was the softest thing I'd ever touched, so deep I'd sunk into it, like a child hiding under blankets. For a long moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling's intricate molding, wondering if this was still a dream. When the quiet knock at the door came, it startled me. A housekeeper stood in the doorway, her smile polite but warm. "Breakfast is served, ma'am," she said. I had never been called ma'am in my life. The dining hall was bigger than my entire shop. A long polished table stretched down the center, gleaming beneath the morning light that poured through a row of windows. The air was rich with the scent of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and something faintly sweet, maybe fruit, maybe flowers from the tall vases placed at intervals along the table. He was already seated at the far end, a white porcelain cup in front of him. "Good morning," he said, gesturing to the chair nearest him. I walked the length of the table, feeling oddly self-conscious. My footsteps seemed too loud against the marble floor, the distance between us both long and symbolic, the space between the life I'd known and whatever this was becoming. A place setting had been arranged with care. A steaming cup of coffee, a small plate of bread still warm from the oven, a dish of butter and honey. "I hope you slept well," he said, watching me over the rim of his cup. "I did," I replied, though the truth was I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the last 24 hours in disbelief. He smiled slightly, as if he'd expected that. "I have something I want to talk to you about." I set my cup down, carefully. "What is it?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but focused. "When I rebuilt my life, I decided to do it differently. I didn't just go back to running my company. I built a foundation, a place where we take what we've been given and use it to create something lasting. Schools, housing, clean water systems, small businesses. We work where it matters most, in communities that the world tends to forget." I listened, the words painting pictures in my mind. Children sitting at desks in bright classrooms, families unlocking doors to houses that were truly theirs, streets without potholes or leaking roofs. "I've been thinking about where we can expand," he continued. "And for that, I need people I can trust. People who understand more than numbers. People who know what it's like to need help, but also what it means to give it." His eyes held mine, steady and unblinking. "That's why I want you." The bread in my hand felt suddenly heavy. "Me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I want you to manage a set of new community projects." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea felt so absurd. I've never done anything like that. I run a shop. That's all I know." "You've managed kindness," he replied simply. "And that's the most important skill." I shook my head. "Kindness doesn't tell you how to run a project or manage money or hire workers." "And yet," he interrupted gently, "without kindness, none of those things mean anything. I can teach you the rest. My team can teach you the rest. What I can't teach is the instinct to put someone else's need above your own. That's what you already have." I didn't know what to say. I thought of my shop, how I'd ration tea leaves so I could give free cups to the old women who came in with tired faces, how I'd let children sit under the porch roof when the sun was too hot, even if they had no money to spend. I'd never thought of it as a skill. It was just life. He leaned forward slightly. "You've lived the problems we're trying to solve. You know the weight of an empty pantry. You know the frustration of a roof that leaks no matter how many times you patch it. You know what it's like to have someone's kindness be the difference between despair and hope." His words sank deep into me. "I wouldn't even know where to start," I murmured. He smiled. "We start with your town." The image came instantly. The cracked road in front of my shop, the sagging porches, the dusty yard where children played barefoot. But in my mind's eye, it began to change. Fresh paint, repaired walls, clean streets, gardens where weeds once grew. "You mean," I began slowly, "we could actually fix things?" He nodded. "Not just fix. Build, create, give people more than survival, give them pride in where they live." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, needing the warmth. "I'm afraid I'll fail." "You will," he said without hesitation. My head snapped up in surprise, but he was smiling. "You'll make mistakes. Everyone does. But failure isn't falling down. It's refusing to get up again. And I know you won't do that." The conviction in his voice unsettled me. It was as though he saw a version of me I hadn't met yet. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. Outside, the morning light was brightening, spilling across the gardens beyond the windows. "Why me?" I asked finally. He didn't hesitate. "Because when I was nothing, you didn't look away. And I want someone like that at the heart of what we're building." I stared into my cup, the steam curling upward like questions I didn't yet know how to answer. The idea of managing projects, of making decisions that could change lives, terrified me. And yet, something inside me stirred. A quiet, dangerous thing called hope. Outside, the faint rumble of car engines starting signaled that the first step into this unknown life was about to begin. In days, my dusty town turned into a place of hope. The morning it began, the air itself felt different, As if it had been holding its breath all night in anticipation, I woke to the distant, low rumble of engines. Not the kind we were used to, small motorbikes or the occasional farm truck, but something deeper, heavier, a vibration that made the glass panes in my shop windows tremble ever so slightly. Stepping outside, the cool morning breeze carried with it the smell of wet earth from the storm earlier in the week, mingled with a faint metallic tang of machinery drawing closer. The street was already alive with curious faces peeking from doorways, children darting out barefoot to see what was coming, their laughter and excited chatter floating above the low hum of conversation among the adults. And then the first truck appeared, turning the bend onto the main street. Massive, with thick tires caked in mud from the countryside, its flatbed stacked impossibly high with neatly bundled bricks, the sharp corners and fresh red clay catching the pale morning light. Behind it came another, and another, the convoy stretching farther than I could immediately count. Cement mixers with their great turning drums, flatbeds laden with steel beams and timber, smaller vans painted with bright, unfamiliar logos in colors so vivid they looked like splashes of joy against our faded buildings. The air seemed to thicken with energy as the trucks slowed, air brakes releasing in hissing bursts, and workers in matching safety vests and sturdy boots jumped down, their voices carrying above the noise as they began unloading. They moved with a rhythm, practiced and confident, calling instructions to one another, guiding forklifts, rolling barrels, setting down stacks of supplies so carefully it was almost ceremonial. By mid-morning, our quiet little street, the one I had known all my life, dusty and uneven, its stones cracked and its gutters clogged, had transformed into a construction site that pulsed with purpose. On the second day, I arrived early just to watch. The old road, once riddled with potholes deep enough to twist an ankle, had been stripped away in long, jagged lines, the sound of pickaxes and jackhammers filling the air. Teams worked in coordinated sections, one group digging narrow trenches for new drainage pipes, another mixing and laying the first layer of asphalt, a third painting crisp white lines along the edges even before the tar had fully cooled. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete, sharp and earthy, mingled with the sweetness of freshly cut timber from the carpenters shaping beams nearby. I watched as they worked beneath the steady rhythm of hammers striking nails, the metallic clink carrying across the square. In the heart of the town, where a barren patch of dirt had sat ignored for years, something remarkable was happening. First, the weeds and broken stones were cleared away by a small army of workers. Then, deliveries began to arrive. Bolts of playground equipment in bright reds, yellows, and blues, each piece carefully unwrapped and laid out like the parts of a puzzle. By afternoon, swings swayed gently in the breeze, slides gleamed in the sunlight, and climbing frames stood proudly, waiting for small hands and feet. The children didn't wait for any ribbon cutting. The moment the swings were bolted in place, they rushed forward, their laughter exploding into the air like fireworks, their feet kicking up dust that glowed in the sunlight. Over by the old well, a relic of our grandparents' time, its stones worn smooth by decades of use, a new well was being dug. The workers moved with determination, shovels biting into the earth in clean, measured strokes until they struck water so clear it sparkled. They installed a pump, sleek and efficient, the kind I'd only ever seen in magazines. And within hours, villagers were lining up to fill their buckets, marveling at the taste of water free from the faint bitterness we had long grown used to. The schoolhouse, too, was unrecognizable. The once cracked walls were now smooth beneath layers of fresh paint, white and sky blue, colors that seemed to pull the daylight right into the building. Inside, desks were sanded down and painted until they gleamed, their surfaces free of the rough splinters that had once scratched our arms. Windows that had been clouded or cracked for years were replaced with clear panes, opening the rooms to the light. Trucks delivered crates filled with brand-new textbooks, their covers crisp and unbent, the ink still smelling faintly of the press. Teachers ran their hands over the pages like they were holding treasure, their eyes shining in a way I'd never seen before. But perhaps the most incredible change wasn't in the buildings or the roads. It was in the people. Where once neighbors had walked with slow, heavy steps, shoulders hunched against the weight of daily hardship, now they moved with energy, their heads held higher. Conversations, once short and pragmatic, stretched into long, animated exchanges. Laughter became a frequent sound, even among those who had forgotten what it felt like to smile without effort. It was as if the repairs and construction had patched something invisible in us as well, a road within our hearts that had long been cracked and neglected. By the end of the week, the main street was paved smooth as glass. The wells were functional. The school was ready for its first full day with the new materials. The playground stood in the center of the town like a jewel, its bright colors visible from every direction. And then, on the 7th day, came the announcement. We gathered in the square, the crowd buzzing with speculation. He stood on the newly repaired steps of the town hall, the microphone in his hand, catching the light. His voice carried easily across the square, warm, yet commanding. "This," he began, gesturing to the streets, the buildings, the smiling faces around him, "is just the beginning. In 1 week's time, we will come together here again, not to build, but to celebrate. To honor not just the work done, but the spirit of the people who live here." His eyes swept across the crowd, and I felt for just a moment that they lingered on me. "I want every one of you here. This is your town, your home, and together, we will make it stronger than ever." The cheer that erupted was unlike anything I'd heard before. It echoed off the fresh-painted walls, lifted into the blue sky, and seemed to settle into the very ground beneath us. A grand celebration was now set for the following week, and though no one yet knew the full extent of what he had planned, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes every day feel like the edge of something extraordinary. I had never seen my people dressed so beautifully. By late afternoon, the square felt like the heart of a festival city, and not the same place where dust used to sit in tired patches beneath our feet. Garlands of marigold and jasmine were laced from pole to pole in long, fragrant chains that swayed when the evening breeze slipped through, and strings of warm lights, newly fixed just yesterday, draped the streets in gentle halos that turned every familiar face into something luminous and almost regal. Women who usually wrapped old shawls around their shoulders now stepped carefully in bright saris and pressed suits, glass bangles singing softly against their wrists, hair oiled and braided with flowers. Men who wore work shirts every day arrived in clean kurtas and crisply ironed trousers, sandals shining, chins freshly shaved, shoulders squared. And the children, my favorite sight, darted between legs in clothes that actually fit, ribbons fluttering, the bold colors of their shirts and dresses catching the falling light like little flags of celebration. A small stage had been built against the newly painted wall of the town hall, its boards sanded smooth and covered with a length of red cloth that made it look important in a way we weren't used to. On either side stood tall vases filled with lilies and sunflowers, their scents mixing with the sweetness of fried snacks from the vendor carts that had been invited to line the square. Music floated over everything, not the tinny crackle we used to get from old speakers, but a clear, round sound from a proper sound system that made the drum beats thrum politely in the chest and set toes tapping without permission. When the first song gave way to the second, older couples smiled at each other shyly and began to sway. Even the sternest shopkeepers were nodding to the rhythm as if the ordinary, stone-faced dignity of adulthood had been loosened by the lantern glow. I stood near the edge of the stage, hands clasped to still their shaking, and I let myself really look, at what had become of our home in a handful of days. The paved road smooth as a promise, the playground bright as a painter's palette, the school windows reflecting the last of the sun like squares of silver. The water pump glinting beside a queue that never looked irritated because clean water made even waiting feel like a gift. The hum of voices swelled whenever a new family entered the square. Each arrival brought a small ripple of applause, as if we were greeting not just our neighbors, but a newer version of them, polished and proud. He arrived without fanfare, which meant people noticed him all at once. One moment he wasn't there, and the next he was walking through the crowd with the light around him, not because of wealth or the cut of his suit, though both were true, but because relief and gratitude seemed to part and wave him forward like a tide. He climbed the 2 steps to the stage and stood at the center, and the murmur dipped immediately. It didn't fall into silence the way fear creates silence, but into that attentive hush that happens when a room agrees to listen together. "Good evening," he said into the microphone, and the speakers returned his voice warm and close, like he was speaking to each of us privately. "If there is beauty here tonight, it isn't the lights or the flowers or the fresh paint. It's you." He gestured to the crowd with an open palm. "It's the way you showed up for your town, the way you opened your doors to workers, the way you tolerated dust and noise because you believed something better was on its way. Kindness is not quiet. It builds, it fixes, it teaches, it cleans, it dreams. You have proven that the applause started in the corner where the teachers stood and rolled outward until the whole square was clapping. I felt my throat grow tight, not with tears just yet, but with a swelling pride that surprised me by how physical it felt, like my chest needed to make room for it. He waited, smiling a little, and then lifted his hands for quiet. "When I walked these streets a short time ago," he continued, "I learned something I never want to forget. That dignity does not ask for wealth's permission to exist. It lives in the way you look after your elders, in the way you share food when there isn't enough, in the way you stand in the rain so someone else can be dry." His eyes found me for a moment, quick, acknowledging, not lingering long enough to embarrass, and I felt the small shock of being seen in public for something that had begun as a private, ordinary act. He spoke about the well, about the new road, about the partnerships that would keep the school supplied for the year. He named people who had lifted more than their share, or who had stayed late when there was no pay for staying late, and each time he named someone, the crowd turned to find them and clap straight at their faces, which made those people look down and smile the proud, shy smile of the honest. He spoke about kindness, like it was a craft that could be practiced and improved, not a random breeze that came and went. He called it a muscle that grows when used. He spoke about the future in plain language, what still needed funding, what would take patience, what success would look like in 1 month, 6 months, a year. And I noticed how people nodded at the clarity, how the square settled into a collective readiness instead of a dreamy haze. When he finished, the music returned softly, and the master of ceremonies called my name to the stage. My stomach folded in on itself. My feet felt briefly like 2 blocks of wood tied to ankles that I couldn't remember walking. But somehow I moved forward because the hands near me, some of them belonging to strangers, patted my arms the way my family would. The steps looked taller than they had when he climbed them, and the microphone seemed larger too, like a small animal I needed to hold just right so it wouldn't leap away. "Good evening," I began, and my voice came out thinner than I wanted. The square answered with a little cheer, not loud, just enough to steady me. I took a breath, not the quick kind people take before apologizing, but a long one that fills the lungs all the way at the bottom. And I tried again. "Good evening," I said stronger. "I don't have the words you just heard. I don't have figures or plans to share. I have only a thank you, and I need it to be big enough for all of you." Laughter rose gently, friendly, the kind that says, "We're with you. Keep going." I told them about opening my shop years ago with a rented key and a prayer, about the way rain used to find my ceiling no matter how many times I patched it, about the morning I wanted to quit, and how an old woman's coins in my hand, not enough to buy much, had somehow felt like a vote of confidence, and how confidence, when it shows up in small handfuls, can be the difference between closing early and keeping the kettle on. I said that our town had given me more than I had ever given it, even when it looked empty from the outside. That sometimes you don't see how full a place is until you pour work into it and watch what rises to the surface. I thanked the workers who learned our children's names by the second day and saved them the first ride on the swings. I thanked the teachers who painted their own classrooms when the volunteers were stretched. I thanked the shy teenagers who came at dusk to stack bricks just because they wanted to stand near the feeling of progress. Somewhere in the middle of it, my voice broke, not in a sob, but in that sideways way. Speech stumbles when it tries to carry more meaning than it was built to. I let it, because it felt honest, and the square, kind as a hand on the shoulder, waited for me to steady. I told them that kindness had saved me when money couldn't. A neighbor's hot meal left without a word on nights when the till came up short. A borrowed umbrella offered across a puddle. A stranger's patience when my change counted out slowly. And that if a town is lucky, it remembers such things and decides to live by them. I did not say his name because the celebration already contained it everywhere. In the lights he'd paid for, in the white lines on the road, in the laughter shaking the swings. But when I turned slightly, he nodded once, and it felt like a private applause passing between only the two of us. I thanked him anyway, with a few simple words, because gratitude doesn't lose its power when it's obvious. Sometimes it grows stronger because everyone knows exactly what you mean. I finished, and for a beat, there was quiet. Not because I had failed, but because the square needed to shift from listening to clapping. And then the clapping came like rain on a good roof, steady and generous, and welcoming. I handed the Vorbeischeu microphone back with hands that still trembled and stepped aside, and in the corner of the stage, a small ensemble of musicians began a tune that belonged to weddings and harvests, and other nights when the town agreed to be happy together. Children pulled their parents' hands, elders were helped to chairs with better views, volunteers set out plates of sweets, and the square loosened into celebration the way a body loosens after a long walk. Relieved, light, grateful for itself. The sun slipped low, and the lights took over the work of making everything shine. Faces looked softer beneath the strings of bulbs. The flowers threw long shadows. The new paint glowed like it had been lit from within. I thought of the first day I'd seen him under the broken tin, of the way the rain had flattened his hair, and the way his hands had shaken around the tea, and I could not reconcile that picture with the one in front of me, except by accepting that kindness can indeed move a person across worlds without changing their core. When the music paused again, and the square quieted, almost without being asked, he stepped forward for one last time. There was something different in his posture now, a contained excitement that made the air around him feel charged. He didn't begin with a greeting or a recap. He let the silence sharpen just a little, the way a cook allows a sauce to thicken before lifting it from the flame. And when he finally lifted the microphone, his smile carried a secret. The lights themselves seemed to lean in to hear. "Before we end," he said, voice warm and sure, "there's one final surprise." The words he spoke next, no one in the square will ever forget. The square was still humming with the warmth of my speech, the music's echo lingering in the air like the scent of flowers that refused to fade. People were still clapping in clusters, passing plates of sweets, calling out compliments, and laughing in the way that only happens when a community remembers itself. Lanterns swayed gently overhead, their light dancing on the polished wood of the stage. Then he stepped forward again, microphone in hand, and the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Not in a heavy way, not like dread or warning, but in that subtle tightening that happens when a crowd senses something important is about to be said. The music faded into silence. Conversations trailed off. Even the children, normally a restless tangle of energy, seemed to pause where they stood. He stood very still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle over us. His gaze swept across the square slowly, not rushing, as though he was memorizing each face, each family, each life gathered there. "When we began this work," he said, his voice calm and steady, "it was about fixing roads, building wells, giving your school what it needed. It was about making your homes safer, cleaner, stronger. But as I watched this town come alive again, I realized something. The air seemed to lean toward him. I realized that the true foundation of any place isn't just the ground it's built on. It's the children," Commercial rippled through the crowd, soft but sharp enough to make my skin prickle. He shifted the microphone to his other hand. "So tonight, I want to tell you something that will matter not just for today, not just for the next year, but for generations." He glanced toward the group of children clustered at the edge of the square, their faces sticky from sweets, their clothes bright from the celebration, and something softened in his expression. "Starting now," he said, his voice deepening just slightly, "there will be a permanent education fund for every child in this town." It was as if the words hung in the air before anyone could fully believe them. And then the sound came, sharp gasps, sharp enough to cut through the stillness, followed by cheers that rose so fast they seemed to carry the whole square into the sky. Women covered their mouths with their hands, eyes shining. Men clapped each other on the back. The teachers, who had been standing together off to the side, held each other's arms in disbelief. He kept speaking over the swell of noise, his words carrying even as voices broke in joy. "Every boy, every girl, every student who calls this town home will have the means to go to school, not just here but beyond. Tuition, books, supplies. It will be covered. No one will be left behind because of money. Not a single child." If the first cheer had been loud, the second was thunder. People were crying openly now, tears cutting lines down cheeks, hands raised in gratitude, heads tilted back as if trying to send thanks to the stars themselves. The square had become a wave of movement and sound, a collective joy so powerful it felt like the ground beneath us might hum with it. I stood at the edge of the stage, my vision blurring as my own tears rose. The lights from the lanterns fractured through them, turning into halos and stars, and for a moment, it was as though the entire night had become something almost holy. I thought of the little ones who came into my shop barefoot, clutching coins in sweaty palms, who would now have futures their parents hadn't dared to dream. I thought of the older children who'd whispered to each other about leaving for the city because there was nothing here, and how now they might not need to leave to find hope. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the tears kept spilling. They were hot against my cheeks, but they didn't carry the sting of sadness. They carried relief, pride. A weight I hadn't realized I was holding seemed to lift from my shoulders. The crowd began chanting his name, the sound rolling and swelling until it seemed like even the air was vibrating with it. He didn't raise his hands for quiet right away. He let them cheer, let them celebrate the gift he'd just given. Only after several long moments did he lean into the microphone again. "This," he said, his voice firm but warm, "is not charity. It's investment. It's belief. It's the knowledge that your children will shape not just their own futures, but the future of this town. And I can't wait to see what they do." When he finally stepped back, the applause didn't fade. It followed him, like a living thing that refused to be put down. People surged toward the front of the stage, reaching out to shake his hand, to thank him, to bless him. The children, some shy, some bold, ran forward and wrapped themselves around his legs in small, sudden hugs that made him laugh. I stayed back for a moment, watching it all unfold. My heart was beating fast, as if it too was trying to keep pace with the energy in the square. I knew, in a way I couldn't fully explain, that this moment was one people would speak about for decades. They would remember where they stood when they heard those words. They would tell their children, and their children would tell theirs. When the crowd finally began to thin, when the music picked up again and people moved toward the food stalls and the dance floor, I stepped down from the stage. My hand still felt warm from holding the microphone earlier, and the cheers still echoed faintly in my ears. It was much later, the moon high and the air cooler, the square lit only by the lanterns and the last embers of celebration, when I felt a hand lightly touch my shoulder. I turned to find him there, his expression softer now, the public figure momentarily set aside for the man I'd first met in the rain. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Something in his tone told me this was not part of the evening's public agenda. Without a word, I nodded, and together we stepped away from the square, the music and laughter fading behind us as we moved into the stillness of the side streets. Whatever he was about to say next would be for my ears alone, and I had no idea it would change everything again. Some promises change the course of your life forever. We left the square the way swimmers leave a bright pool for the quiet of a moonlit shore, the sounds of celebration receding behind us in soft waves, laughter thinning into the distance, drumbeats becoming a heartbeat I could almost mistake for my own, the lanterns on strings shrinking to fireflies over the shoulders of the last dancers. The air past the town hall was cooler, touched with the sweetness of crushed marigold and the faint iron scent of the new pump that had been used so much that evening. The stones around it glittered with spilled water. He walked beside me without speaking, his steps measured, neither hurried nor slow, as though the silence between us needed to arrive at its destination with dignity. We turned down the lane that led toward the school, and then away from it again, cutting through a narrow passage I had walked 1,000 times in daylight, but never at this hour, when the night wraps familiar corners in an unfamiliar hush. A stray cat blinked at us from the low wall, its eyes lamp-bright. Somewhere a radio murmured in a house not yet ready to surrender to sleep. He stopped at a spot where the new road met the old dirt path, where the edge of our transformation still showed its seam, and he faced me as if there were an altar hidden in airy space between. He said, not the public thanks, smooth and practiced, but something smaller, rawer, a thanks that fit in one person, for what you did that day in the rain, for what you've done since. We both remember. That's why I glanced back toward the dresses moved. Ask. Promise me. Not just were. Not dressed in poetry. They weren't wrapped in a speech. They came like a simple door opening. Yet I felt their size as they crossed the small space to me, the way one feels the weight of a key, without needing to see the door it belongs to. Images rose unbidden. A girl counting coins at my counter, a boy with dust on his knees waiting for his mother's shift to end, the thin wrists of the old man cradling a cup of tea as if it were a fire. The months when I'd eaten bread twice a day and called it plenty, the sound of rain on a tin roof that does not keep its promises. I thought of how easily the world can turn its face away from hunger if hunger keeps quiet. I thought of how loud pain becomes when someone finally decides to listen. I don't know where this path is going, I admitted, the truth tasting clean as if it had been washed in the new well. I don't know who I'll be when I get to the end of it. But I know where it started. I lifted my eyes to his. It started with a person in the rain. It started with saying yes to a small, inconvenient kindness. And it keeps starting there. Every day he didn't rush me. He let the night breathe around my words. A branch above us released a single drop that found the curve of my wrist and paused there, cool as a reminder. So, I said, feeling something align inside me that had been tilting since the first time I saw him shiver under the broken tin. I promise. I didn't dress it up either. I wanted the sentence bare, strong, able to stand on its own feet. I promise I will protect the ones with nothing, when it rains, when it is difficult, when there's no applause, when no one is watching. I promise to be someone's dry porch. He exhaled, a breath that carried relief and respect in equal measure. He stepped forward and held out his hand. It wasn't the public handshake of deals and photographs, but the old-fashioned joining of palms that seals the invisible. Two people agreeing to become custodians of a principle. I placed my hand in his, and the contact was firm, warm, unhurried. The night seemed to mark it in its ledger. "Good," he said softly. "Hold to it when the road gets muddy." He released my hand and looked up. I followed his gaze to the blank, generous sky, a bowl turned over our heads. "Promises like this one will ask things of you. They'll ask you to exhaust yourself, and then to rest in the right way. They'll ask you to forgive the people who should have helped and didn't. They'll ask you to keep your patience when progress looks like standing still. But they will also fill you with a strength you can't borrow from anywhere else." We began to walk again, not back toward the music, but along the seam where new road met old path. He told me about communities he'd seen break apart because the work was done by pride instead of service, how villages can learn to compete for attention instead of cooperating for outcomes, how sometimes the first victory is staying in the room when you want to leave. I told him about the unglamorous parts of our days, the arguments at the pump when the queue is long, the way a single rumor can sour a week of effort, the pride that keeps a person from accepting help, even when that help is a hand-up and not a handout. In the telling, our two maps began to overlay, the contours of his experience aligning with the landmarks of my small life, until the path ahead looked less like a guess and more like a road we could name. We paused at the gate of the school, the paint so fresh it still wore the faint sheen of newness. Beyond the windows, rows of desks stood expectant, the chalkboards clean and waiting, a stack of books still tied with twine on the teacher's table like a promise that had dressed itself neatly for the morning. He rested his fingers on the ironwork a moment, not to claim it, but as one touches the shoulder of a friend. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll bring the headmaster the first set of forms for the fund. We'll meet the parents in small groups. We'll explain how it works, slowly, so no one leaves confused. We'll do it in the language that sits in their throats easily." He smiled a little. "And you'll stand beside me, because the town trusts you as it is still learning to trust me." I nodded, feeling both the size of the task and the ease that came from knowing where to begin. "We'll go door to door if we have to," I said. "We'll sit on porches and under neem trees. We'll draw diagrams in dust if the paper runs out." He laughed softly, and the sound threaded a kind of brightness through the dark. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly how this will work." Then the brightness softened. "And when it's too much, you'll say so. I'm not asking you to be tireless. I'm asking you to be true." We turned back at last, the square now a distant constellation of light. As we walked, a breeze rose, cool fingers in the leaves, lifting the scent of the flowers that still garlanded the poles, shifting the faint music that remained into a lullaby for the streets. When we reached the fork where our paths parted, his back toward the mansion road, mine toward the small house I had not yet learned to stop calling mine, though the keys in my pocket insisted otherwise. He stopped once more. "I meant what I said earlier," he told me, voice stripped of the stage, just a man finishing a sentence that mattered. "Tonight will be remembered for the announcement. But what will change this town is the promise, not mine. Yours, I felt it then, not the weight of pressure, but the weight of purpose, heavy in the way a full bucket is heavy, burden and blessing in one hand, both telling you you're carrying something worth the lift." "I won't forget," I said. "Not when it's raining. Especially when it's raining." He inclined his head, a small bow that felt like respect, paid to a future not yet written, and then he turned toward his road while I took mine, the distance between us opening gently like a book to its next chapter. At home, at the mansion, I corrected myself awkwardly in thought, like a student fixing a habit. I set the keys on the bedside table and sat for a long while in the quiet. The celebration still hummed faintly in my bones. The stage lights still lived behind my eyelids when I blinked. I poured water from the jug and drank, then turned off the lamp and lay down, expecting exhaustion to pull me under in seconds. It didn't. I stared into the darkness, listening to the first tentative taps of a new drizzle find the window pane, and I could not sleep for thinking of the rain. The storm outside my window felt like a memory replaying itself. The first drops came quietly, tapping against the tall glass panes of my bedroom as though asking for permission to enter. I was sitting at the desk by the window, reading over notes for the next week's community meeting, when the sound deepened, a soft patter becoming a steady drumming, then the heavy percussion of a storm that meant to stay a while. The air shifted with it, that sharp, earthy scent of rain rising from the gardens below, mingled with the faint perfume of wet jasmine climbing the wall outside. I leaned back in my chair, the polished wood creaking softly, and let my eyes wander past the manicured hedges and lantern-lit driveway to where the tall iron gates marked the edge of the property. The rain blurred everything beyond them into silver streaks, just as it had on that day years ago, when I'd stood in the doorway of my shop and seen him, wet, shivering, holding nothing but the dignity that had made me step outside with my umbrella. A flash of movement caught my attention. At first it was just a darker shape against the gray wash of the storm, small and hunched, barely more than a silhouette through the sheets of water. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw him, a boy, maybe 12 or 13, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt clinging to his thin frame, water dripping from his fingertips. He stood just outside the gates, gripping the bars like they were the only thing keeping him upright. His bare feet shifted on the wet ground, toes curling against the cold. The sight pulled me upright before I realized I'd moved. I set the papers aside, the chair rolling back with a quiet scrape, and crossed the room in a few quick steps. By the time I reached the front hall, I was already pulling my umbrella from its stand, the same black one I'd used so many times before, its handle polished smooth by years of holding on in storms. The butler at the door started to speak, perhaps to ask if I was sure about stepping out, but I shook my head. "He's alone," I said simply, and that was all the explanation needed. The moment I stepped outside, the rain met me with a force that soaked my sleeves in seconds, cold and insistent, running in rivulets down my arms. I opened the umbrella and held it low, angling it against the wind as I walked down the long driveway, the gravel crunching faintly under my shoes despite the water. Each step brought the boy into clearer focus, his face pale, his eyes downcast, his shoulders trembling with a mixture of cold and something harder to name. When I reached the gate, he looked up sharply, startled, as though he hadn't expected anyone to come. For a heartbeat, we simply regarded each other, me on one side of the iron bars, he on the other, the storm wrapping us both in its relentless curtain. "You'll freeze out here," I said, my voice raised just enough to be heard over the rain. He hesitated, glancing past me toward the sprawling house, its windows glowing softly against the dark. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the slight shake in his jaw betrayed the lie. I remembered another voice in another storm, saying something similar. I remembered how hard it had been for him to accept even the smallest gesture, so I didn't argue. Instead, I reached through the bars, holding the umbrella toward him. "Come on," I said, my tone as steady as I could make it. "Let's get you dry." It took him a moment, but finally, with a reluctance born of pride rather than mistrust, he stepped forward. I swung the gate open and held it while he slipped inside, then closed it gently behind us. We walked side by side up the driveway, the umbrella covering us both. He kept his head down, watching the gravel darken under each step. When we reached the porch, I gestured toward a chair just inside the wide double doors. "Sit," I said. "I'll have someone bring you a towel." He hesitated again, glancing toward the open space behind me. The chandelier above the foyer, the polished floor, the warmth radiating from the lit fireplace at the far end. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said, almost under his breath. "You're not," I told him. "You're just here. And that's fine." As he settled onto the chair, water pooling beneath his feet, I couldn't help but see the overlap of two images. The boy in front of me now, and the man who had once sat shivering under my shop's porch roof, hands curled around a cup of tea I'd placed there. One had been a stranger who would turn out to be a CEO. The other, well, I had no idea yet. The thought made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite name, a mixture of recognition, hope, and the weight of the promise I'd made not so long ago under a very different night sky. I handed him the towel myself when it came, and as he rubbed at his hair, I said lightly, "You know, sometimes you step outside thinking you're just helping someone stay dry. And sometimes you find out that moment changes more than just the weather." He gave me a curious look at that, but didn't ask for more. I didn't press. Some stories aren't told in their first chapter. Thus, rain continued, heavy and unrelenting, filling the house with its low, constant music. Somewhere deep in the walls, the warmth from the fire reached out, softening the air between us. I thought of all the times I'd walked past strangers without knowing their stories, of how one day in the rain had rewritten mine entirely, and of how impossible it is to guess which moments will become the ones that matter. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were clearer, though his hands still fidgeted with the edge of the towel. "Thank you," he said, voice small but sure. I nodded once. "You're welcome. That's what we do here." As I watched him settle into the warmth, the storm still raging beyond the glass, I thought of that first day in the rain. And I knew this for certain. You never know who that stranger might be, or how they might change your life. This isn't just a story about kindness. It's about how a single moment can rewrite an entire life. From a stranger in the rain to a gift that changed a whole town, every scene will pull you deeper. Watch till the end, because the final twist will leave you speechless and might just change the way you see the next stranger you meet. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.